Pleased to say the General Secretary of the TUC, Paul Nowak, joins us now. Paul, good morning to you. Thanks for being with us this morning. Now, you've talked about a fair deal for workers. The nurses are asking for 5% above RPI inflation. Is that a fair deal, considering the pay restraints that the government must have in place?
Well, listen, we've got 133,000 vacancies in our NHS at the moment. We've got a staffing crisis, and I don't think another real terms pay cut for nurses, but not just nurses, for paramedics, for physiotherapists, for anybody working in our NHS is going to help solve that staffing crisis. So I think what's important now, Kamal, is that we've got ministers who are empowered to talk about pay with unions and to listen to their own workforce. So yesterday, I wrote to the Prime Minister and asked him to urgently meet with me and other union leaders. But crucially, he's got to allow his ministers to get around a table with our unions and reach a fair settlement on pay. What their fair settlement is going to look like, I can't say, and I can't negotiate live on your programme this morning, but we really do need to have those negotiations.
But you suggest that you want it to be above inflation, and inflation's running at, what, 10.7% right now?
Yeah, but as I say, it's not my job to negotiate the pay of our nurses or paramedics or anybody else. What I'm saying is those workers, very clearly, and I was on those picket lines with the paramedics just before Christmas, each and every one of those workers told me they can't afford another year of a real terms pay cut. The reality is their mortgages are going up, their food bills are going up, their rent and mortgages are going up. The only thing that isn't going up is their wages. And I think the government has to take some responsibility here now, step up to the plate, facilitate those talks. Let's get a fair pay settlement for our NHS workers, but indeed public sector workers right across the piece.
And you've asked for a meeting with the Prime Minister. You've sent the letter, what, today, when you're expecting a response, and what do you think he will say to you?
Well, I would hope you would recognise the urgency of a meeting. And just to say, I mean, during the pandemic, the TUC worked very closely with Rishi Sunak in developing the furlough scheme alongside the CBI. It seems that the Prime Minister has forgotten some of those basic lessons from the pandemic, that actually we come up with better solutions when we work together. And, you know, the NHS staffing crisis isn't going to solve itself. Neither is the staffing crisis in other parts of our public services. 1 in 6 new teachers leaves the profession within a year of qualifying. There is something wrong with our public services, and that's what happens when you have a decade of underfunding, understaffing and real terms pay cuts for public sector workers.
I mean, you say he's forgotten some of the principles. What do you think he's forgotten?
I think he's forgotten the value of sitting down and reaching an agreement and taking ideas from people outside his own cabinet. And frankly, you know, I think it'd be really good for Rishi Sunak to talk to our unions, but also to talk to some of those frontline paramedics, those physiotherapists, the teachers in classrooms, civil servants, people who for the last decade have been placed under real pressures on workload, who feel at a breaking point. Let the Prime Minister talk to those workers and understand their concerns and their issues. I think that's what any decent employer would do. And as someone responsible for the employment of millions of public sector workers, that's exactly what the Prime Minister should do as well.
And of course, the government will say that there are pay offers on the table for nurses, there are pay offers on the table for some of the other people who are out on strike. So this is not a case of them not listening. This is a case of unions trying to demand even more that's unaffordable at this point.
It's not a case of unions demanding the unaffordable. Politics is all about choices, and the government has got some big, clear choices in front of us. It could, for example, decide to tax more heavily the excess profits of the oil and gas companies. It could decide to tax wealth in the same way it taxes incomes. But the reality is, each and every single one of our public sector workers at the moment faces a real terms pay cut. And that comes on the back of a decade of pay cuts. The average nurse, £4,000 a year, worse off than if their pay would have risen by the rate of inflation since 2008. Something has got to give, and I think the Prime Minister needs to listen to his own workforce. Let's
talk a little bit more about nurses then, because you brought them up again. You say something's got to give. Now, as I said, they're asking for 5% above RPI. Now, when they asked for that back in the summer, I think it was going to run about 14% would be the payoff. And now, as we know, it's around about 19%. Do you think that might be a misstep in their strategy? And would you like to see them come back with a different demand?
Listen, the dynamics always change in a pay negotiation once you're sat round a table. But what we've got at the moment is, for example, Steve Barclay, just before Christmas, our Health Secretary, in the midst of a dispute around pay, has said he'll talk to our unions about anything other than pay. I just don't think that's tenable.
And the only way you get independent pay review boards who deal with that.
Listen, the government has been using the independent review bodies as a human shield, and I think is in real danger of discrediting those bodies. When those bodies met and made their recommendations, we didn't have inflation running at 10-11%. The government, in its evidence to those pay review bodies, set the very clear financial parameters that the bodies could work within. So listen, let's not hide behind the pay review bodies. What we need is the government to sit round the table with our unions and reach an agreement.
I mean, there are serious calls here, Paul, and some accusations as well that perhaps the government is not being entirely fair in these negotiations. Now, you want to have a meeting with the Prime Minister about this. Are you going to tell him that you think he's sabotaging the negotiations, that they're not being fair?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'll say to the Prime Minister directly what I'd say to you this morning. And, you know, the key thing for me, I'm not interested in political point scoring. I'm not interested in meeting the Prime Minister just for, you know, tea and sympathy or indeed beer and sandwiches. I'm interested in meeting the Prime Minister. Our unions are interested in meeting the Prime Minister so we can resolve these disputes and put pay in the pockets of hard-working public service workers and deliver the public services that the people of this country deserve. And the public's verdict is pretty clear. 2/3 of the public blame the government for mishandling these strikes. It's time for the government to listen to the public, listen to its own workforce, get round the table with unions.
And while many, of course, will accept those calls by the public sector workers, there is a real hit to the economy by some of these strikes, not, of course, not with nurses' strikes, but with the train driver strikes and the train worker strikes. Some £2.5 billion lost to the economy. I mean, as the country's saying that it can't afford to raise wages, it can't afford to deal with the loss to income that it's getting from these strike action.
Well, there's a real hypocrisy here because every single day of strike action, while rail workers are losing pay, the government is effectively underwriting the losses of the privatised train companies. That makes no financial sense whatsoever. And the other thing that really sucks demand out of local economies is when rail workers or indeed nurses, teachers, supermarket workers don't have money in their pockets to spend in local shops and restaurants. Now, our rail unions are very clear. They want those disputes resolved. They want their members back to work. They regret any impact on the economy. But the responsibility for these strikes, the responsibility for the strikes in the public sector lies very clearly with the government.
I mean, that regret is, of course, truly felt. But these strikes are going on. I spoke to Mick Lynch yesterday. He said they could run on for months to come. He's got a mandate up until May. You'll know that many mandates run until well into the new year. How do you expect these strikes to continue? Because the strike action so far has not had anything like the effect you'd like it to have on the government making those decisions.
Well, I think it's had a very clear impact on public opinion, and I know I know talking to people who walked past that picket line in Waterloo a couple of weeks ago, the public are very clear when it comes to a straight fight between Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt and Steve Barclay and our nurses and paramedics. I know where public sympathy lies. I would like the government to listen to the concerns of their own workforces. Forget me, forget union leaders, think about the millions of people day in, day out who deliver our public services. The least the government could do is show them the respect of listening to them, talking to them and reaching agreement with them.
And if they don't, you're not in a general strike yet, but there are consecutive days of action. It feels like almost like a general strike. Is that where you go to next? How do you increase the pressure?
Well, you know, it's a really difficult decision for any worker who takes strike action. They do lose pay. They don't get to deliver the services that they're proud to deliver. So my responsibility, the responsibility of our unions, is when members take that difficult decision, we have to make sure that that action is as impactful as possible and as effective as possible. So we're always talking to our unions about how we make sure we maximise the impact of industrial action, how we maximise the call on the government. I don't want to be in a position, least of all our public sector workers don't want to be in a position where people are taking strike action. But really, the ball is in the government's court. They need to talk to their own workforce. We've seen employers right across the private sector where workers have taken industrial action, listen to their own workforces and reach agreements, and I'd urge the government to do the same.
So there can be more coordination. You want to see more pressure being put forward?
Well, I think it absolutely makes sense, for example, in education and in health, where you've got a number of different unions, for unions to talk to each other about how we support each other, coordinate our action. That makes absolute sense to me.
Let's be clear on what you're saying here. Support each other and coordinate action. That means going out on the same day, all out on strike.
No, it doesn't necessarily mean that at all, Kamali. I mean, it may actually be better to have a focus for particular groups of workers on particular days. And, you know, what I'm really interested in is not posturing or grand strategising. What I'm really interested in is getting a resolution for public sector workers. And, you know, as I say, I would urge the Prime Minister to talk to our unions and talk to those frontline workers, because I think they deserve the respect of being listened to and their concerns taken on board.
Is there a concern? Is there a danger in this action? And if it does increase in ways that you're describing, that the government try and push through some more of those anti-strike laws? And I'm sure that will be something you discuss with the Prime Minister as well if you get that meeting.
I mean, that is a real danger. I think it would be a real mistake from the government, because what that would be doing is treating the symptoms of the strikes rather than the underlying causes, which is those real terms pay cuts. But let me be absolutely clear, if the Prime Minister brings forward more legislation to make it even more difficult for workers to take strike action, the TUC will fight that. We'll fight that politically. We'll fight it legally as well. We already have a legal challenge in with the government. 11 TUC unions challenging the government's decision to allow employers to use agency workers to break strikes. We think the government will be very close to a breach in fundamental international labour law, and we'd ask them to step back from that brink. And rather than messing around with the right to strike, what they should be doing is negotiating settlement of these disputes and delivering a fair pay rise for public sector workers.
OK. Paul Nowak from TUC, I do appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much for coming in.